Good morning and welcome to All Saints Church on this day when we celebrate the feast of St. Mary of Magdalene. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey, we are thrilled that you have found us. We are live streaming on Zoom and also on Facebook. So share us, join us, and settle back for what I just know is going to be extraordinarily inspiring and informative forum. A couple of housekeeping pieces. We do welcome everyone on board today. We have at All Saints Church, we always put our faith into action. And our action this week is supporting our siblings working to end homelessness through Union Station. So in a moment, if it's not already there in the chat, there'll be an opportunity to engage in an opportunity to get a $100,000 grant for Union Station. And tomorrow is the deadline for that voting, so I encourage you to act on that. We remain closed on campus due to the safer at home orders, but we are live and busy online. So for more information about our work and witness at All Saints Church that continues, COVID-19 notwithstanding, please do visit our website for information about programs, opportunities, options, and ways to outreach. So enough about that. I'm Susan Russell. I'm one of the priests on staff here, and it's my privilege today to welcome you on behalf of our rector and community to this forum. We welcome today, as we celebrate the Feast of Mary Magdalene, transferred from July 22nd, the Reverend Dr. Wil Gafney, a scholar, pastor, preacher, and activist. Dr. Gafney is a professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School in Fort Worth, Texas, and we're honored by her presence here at All Saints last year as a scholar in residence. A noted author and editor, Dr. Gafney is currently working on a women's lectionary and looking forward to that being published at some time in the not too distant future, we hope. And this morning, she is here with us as we celebrate the work and witness of Mary Magdalene, remembering this is someone who was called the Apostle of the Apostles, and yet had her story virtually erased from our scriptural history, and in the Episcopal Church was relegated to lesser feasts and fasts. So that's one of the reasons we always move her over to a Sunday. And in preparing for today, we thought there was no one better than Dr. Gafney to lead us in a timely and important conversation as we explore the historic pattern of systemic erasure of women's voices and stories in our biblical canon, and how that connects to the erasure of other voices and stories, women's, people of color, queer people, a whole list in our civic canon as well. So enough for me. Welcome back, Dr. Gafney. We are so delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back, and I'm going to ask you to tell me one more time what my time limit is so that I can stay on track.
Right, we have until 11, which is a hard finish for Children's Chapel, and we'd love to have some time toward the end, maybe 10 minutes for questions that we're going to ask folks to put in the chat. So if you want to time it around that, we're at 10:03 now. You can take it away.
Perfect. So as Reverend Susan and I were talking, emailing frantically, I cast my mind back to when I first started to do theology on my own, before I knew I was called to the ministry or even went to seminary. And some of you who follow me may have just heard me tell this story to Bishop Flunder. And that is, I was reading theology on my own, wandering the library, and I came across Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza's In Memory of Her. And she talks about the woman who anointed Jesus and what the gospel text says, what Jesus says in the gospel story, that wherever the gospel is preached, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Now, we put a pretty high priority on Jesus in Christianity. We put a pretty high priority on the gospel. And some put an even higher priority on what they call the red words, the things that Jesus is said to have said that in some editions of the Bible are printed in red words so that as you're scanning the pages, you can see Jesus said this or is reported to have said this. So if Jesus, the center of our faith and devotion and the one whom we emulate, said, let us not preach the gospel without telling this story of this woman and what she has done, why isn't her name in the gospel? And why do we so often tell the story of what she has done without her? Or let me put it this way, the foot washing is what she did. When we celebrate communion in the Episcopal Church and in most Christian churches, we no longer remember this woman and her anointing of Jesus. We don't tell the story. We don't reenact it the way we do on Maundy, Thursday. So once a year, she might be drug out of her closet. And that was a strong disconnect for me as I thought about what it means to be a woman in the tradition. So let's move forward a number of years to where we are today as I take up this idea that, and since we're live, some of you know I have a cat and I was just stabbed. As we take up this idea that women in the text are marginalized by the text itself, as well as by patterns of translation, interpretation, and preaching. And here's what I mean. Of all the people who have their name, full name, first name, family name mentioned in the text, about 90% of them are male. And that means that the ways in which the stories, which are our religious and spiritual foundation, were produced, were told orally, but certainly were written down and preserved for us, was to eliminate the names of women, even when the characters are there, oftentimes. But yet and still, there are, at least in the Hebrew Bible and the deuterocanonical writings, which are the focus of my study, a surprising number of women's names that are left to us. And so the lectionary project that we were just discussing was born out of that, an attempt to permit readers and hearers of the scriptures in worship encounter a completely different set of text, to hear the stories of these women and girls, even when it's just a snippet, and see what happens when we tell the story, remembering her name, calling her name, centering these women characters. So I'd like to have some of our talk back now at this part of my presentation with you all. I'm missing being in the room, but also grateful so many more of you from so many more places can be present with us. And I'd like to ask you, just as an exercise, for those of you who will type in the chat, those of you who are on another platform and want to write it down or call it out, what are the names of some women and girls that you know in the scriptures? Because the list that I'm aware of goes up to 111 for women in the Hebrew Bible. And I can tell you that even as a biblical scholar, even as a pastor, priest, and preacher, I can't come up with that many names. So I want to give a moment to hear what some of our participants are coming up. And I'm seeing a lot of Marys. There's so many Marys. You can say Mary and you can get 12 points on the exam. I'm seeing Tabitha and Miriam, and Eve, Deborah, Sarah, Hannah, a bunch more Marys, Ruth, Esther, Michael, somebody's wading a little deep, Hagar. I'm hearing some names. What about the Bathsheba? All right. What about the most common woman's name in the Hebrew scriptures? We know that Mary, or really Miriam in its original form, I see you calling out Orpah, that Mary and Miriam are the most common woman's name in the Christian Testament. In the Hebrew Bible, the most common woman's name is Ma'akah, M-A-A-C-A-H. And there are more Ma'akot. I'm using the Hebrew plural as a bit of a pun there. There are more women named Ma'akah in the Hebrew Bible than there are women named Mary in the New Testament, just to give you a sense of scope and scale. So why does it matter that we know these names and call these names, and that we get out beyond the women who are major characters in the stories of men? It matters that for whatever the reasons and with whatever biases, our ancestors left these texts to us because they tell us things that they believed profoundly about God and things that they experienced. And we know that everyone in a community does not experience the same events the same way. And it's worthwhile asking if our theological claims hold water when we attribute them to characters who are minoritized in the tradition. And so I'm going to use as my first example a formula that many of us are familiar with from the Hebrew scriptures, which is that God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, if you were going to add all of the women who helped produce the children of those men so that we could move in those 3 generations, who would you add? Now, I've already seen some of you put Sarah in and Hagar when I asked you who are the women you know. So I'm going to ask you to go back to the chat or to the person you're watching this video with or in your room, write it out. Who are the other people who would be added? I see Rachel and Rebecca. Yes. Hagar. Hagar's been in the room several times and we're glad to call her name Leah. All right. Some of you know your biblical matriarchs, but it kind of dwindles. Well, Bathsheba would not be on that list of those 3 patriarchs. So I'm telling a story in the wide open public market about a priest, so I'm not going to name the church, but this particular priest and I would have conversations about naming, and particularly naming women. And there is a Eucharistic prayer in the Episcopal Church that has the names of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so this priest was celebrating Mass and I was there, and he kind of side-eyed me and he said, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of Rachel, pause, prayerful pause, Rebecca, and then he just carried on because those were all the names he had. If we were to say that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the God of Hagar, Sarah, Keturah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Bilhah, and Zilpah, would our theological claims hold weight? Abraham was married to Sarah. Hagar was enslaved to them, really enslaved to Sarah. She made her sexually available to Abraham, which we really should read as a sexual violation, as a rape, as a forced impregnation, forcible surrogacy. And of course, Isaac married Rebecca. Isaac is the rare biblical patriarch who does not practice polygamy. Maybe he looked at his daddy's household, I don't know. But then comes Jacob with Rachel and Leah. They each have a woman enslaved to them, Bilhah and Zilpah. They make them available for rapine and forcible surrogacy. So now, if we've got this theological claim, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we can talk about Bible stories and covenant and promises and see their family grow and spread and talk about divine favor. And it looks good. It's a good, solid theological proposition. But if we then start to say that God is the God of, and I see somebody has used the language of concubines in the chat room, and all of my students are going, ooh, because a concubine is a person who is available for sexual use, but whose children are not legitimate. These women were enslaved, but they were also wives. They were low status wives or secondary wives. So let's ask these women, all of them together, high status and low status wives together. Could we make the same theological claim that God is the God of Hagar and Sarah and Keturah and Rebecca and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah? Because for some of them, the God who is the God of the story is the God of the enslaver and the God of the rapist, right? So we're going to have to ask different theological questions and make different theological claims if we want to take seriously the experience of Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah in the nation building of Israel. It becomes a different story. And so that's one example of how and why it matters that we not only say the names, as has become important in our contemporary culture, where the hashtag say her name was developed so that we not forget that Black women are shot dead in the street by police as well. So say her name is important for naming, but for calling to memory and dealing with the trouble in the text or the trouble in the streets in front of us. So looking at the matriarchs and patriarchs is one example of what happens when we start not just saying the names of characters in the text, but learning their stories and asking questions of the text and of the God of the text. Determining for ourselves as a community of readers empowered by the Spirit as to whether the theological claims hold true for everyone in the pages of the scripture, for everyone in the world that hears and reads and interprets the text. So I have another example that I'd like to walk through with you, and I'm going to share my screen with you, and we're going to look at a couple of slides. All right. There's the share button. All right. So I've adapted this talk for us today, and we're going to talk about the prophets while we're talking about calling the names of women who are marginalized in their presentation in the scriptures and who are marginalized, quite frankly, in the teaching and preaching of the scriptures. So when we talk about the prophetic books from the perspective of teaching the Hebrew Bible as the Hebrew Bible is ordered in Judaism, we're talking about the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, in addition to those prophets whose names you may be familiar with. So now I'm going to ask you, what other prophets do you know besides these guys, right? So when you're naming the prophets, who's on your list? Again, this is a very familiar list. In the Christian canon, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are not counted as prophetic books. In the Christian canon, Daniel is counted as a prophetic book, whereas in the Jewish canon, Daniel is counted as a book of writings, the third section of the Bible after Torah, prophets, then comes writings. But who's missing? I can't see you in the chat, but I hope you are furiously typing out the names of women prophets and other marginalized prophets, prophets who do not have books in the Bible. I call these characters prophets on the margins, and I've taught a number of courses under that title. So who are some of the prophets on the margins of Torah? Well, Miriam is the first person in the canon identified as a prophet. And if we were studying prophets the way many do in seminaries or universities, we'd only be studying books written by people called prophets. We'd be looking at those prophetic books on one of the two lists I showed you earlier, which means we wouldn't be studying Miriam. Some of you may know my very first book is called Daughters of Miriam. And I understand Miriam as the mother of all prophets, not just women prophets. But if we only study the books of the prophets with someone's name on them, then we've not studied all the prophets. We've just studied those authored books or books with those claims. But if we study the prophets and we study all the prophets, then we're studying Miriam, then we're studying Huldah, who essentially canonized the first written text of what would go on to become the Hebrew Bible, Deborah, Noadiah, who had Nehemiah scared to death for good reason. And there's that time God told Isaiah to write something and have it notarized. And God gave Isaiah the names of the men who could serve as notaries. The language in the biblical text in most English translations is something like attested. I say notarized because that's a little more familiar. And Isaiah went to a woman prophet and they conceived a child. And as I tell my students, it probably took a while. So he went and worked on this piece of prophecy for a while. And at some point, she became pregnant and delivered. And then the message that God had given him became that baby's name, Maher-shalal-hash-baz. You can find this in Isaiah chapter 8, verses 1 through maybe 4. For those of you who know the brilliant actor, Maher-shalal Ali, his name was actually Maher-shalal-hash-baz from this passage in Isaiah before he embraced Islam. So if we were studying just prophets, I'm going to end the share now, hopefully, and just keep talking while I'm trying to do that. If we were to study prophets and not study any of those prophets on the margin, some of them are non-Israelite prophets like Balaam. Some of you may remember him from the donkey in the road incident. Well, Balaam's a very important prophet in the world beyond the Hebrew Bible. He's the one prophet in the text of the Hebrew Bible who is documented outside its pages. So if we just read and studied prophets, looking at the table of contents in our Bible, we would have missed a significant number of prophets. So that's my second example. And so now I'd like to go back to the framing of this conversation where Reverend Susan set up the paradigm in which women are marginalized in the pages of Scripture. They're marginalized in the traditions of the church, including preaching from the Scripture. And ask you to think with me as we begin to shift to a time of conversation shortly. What is it that we can do? We who are participants in worship, we who may have some responsibility in shaping worship, we who lead worship. What is it that we can do? And for me, the response is biblical literacy. It matters that our teaching and preaching be diverse and go beyond the constraints of our lectionary, which is itself a largely male production and presents many fewer women with which for us to engage and reflect and ask the questions if the promises of God made to and through the men who are important standard bearers in our scriptures are also true to the women who support them, stand with them, sometimes stand behind them, and sometimes are treated really badly by them and by the text. It forces us to ask the question, who is God in the text, in the world of the text, and who is God in this world in which I'm reading the biblical text. In my book, Womanist Midrash, I use the description God in the text and God beyond the text, because I make the argument that sometimes the limitations of the text leave us with a God who is entirely too small to be the God of this world, and certainly too small and too mean and mean-spirited to be the God of women, of non-binary folk, whom the biblical authors didn't engage and reflect on, though we know historically, biologically, sociologically, and anthropologically, human beings come in diverse bodies and always have. So I'd like to push us towards looking to embrace a God who is big enough for all of us and the bodies in which we come, the bodies in which we live, the bodies in which we flourish, because that too is incarnational theology. So we're now hearing a cat cry. That too is incarnational theology. Finally, before we turn to conversation and question, thinking about Mary Magdalene, I think about her as a woman who has been misremembered. Some of you know that there are traditions, long-standing traditions, that emanate from a papal proclamation that identify Mary Magdalene as a prostitute when that is not in the text. And I've had the opportunity to be in conversation with sex workers about that identification. And even though we now know that that is a false identification, it was one that was welcomed and embraced by women in this particular gathering I was in, who sell sex and work in a variety of sex service industries, to know that there was someone that Jesus loved dearly, who was at his side and at his table, who was a sex worker. And so while that description is not historically true, I think there's room enough in the circle of truths and truthiness about who she was and who she was to Jesus, that we can continue to welcome and embrace our sisters and our kin and our brothers and our cousins who do sex work in the church. Maybe not do sex work in the church, but who do sex work as part of the church. So now I'm going to ask you to be in conversation with me. When I do these talks in person, I often like to pull them short in terms of time because I want to hear from folk, and folk have a lot of questions. So I know there are people monitoring the chats and taking questions. So while you are slowly typing out your questions and observations, and I believe Reverend Susan's going to field them, I'm going to invite her to enter into dialogue with me about what I've presented so far, to give you time to set up the questions and to get them monitored. So, Sister Susan.
Great, thank you so much. I did not oversell your ability to guide us and lead us and continue to teach us and challenge us. A question that I have is, and we'll get to some of the questions in the chat. I see 2 so far. Please keep them coming. We're putting them in the chat, and the panelists can all see them. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it hasn't gone through. I'm really intrigued by this idea of erasing history that seems to be part of our collective narrative right now. And the idea that when we change the history we've received, by amplifying voices which have been previously erased, the accusation is that we're changing history and erasing it. We've certainly gone through that for a number of decades in the church, as feminist and womanist studies have challenged leading narratives on how we've read and understood texts. And I wonder if you see any connection between, it's kind of a leading question, but between the who owns the story, to go back to Hamilton, who lives, who dies, who tells the story, who's telling the story of our history and the names from the margins that need to be amplified and brought to the center now in our civic discourse, and how we can maybe take what we've learned in this biblical work and use it to inform our civil exegesis as well. Does that make sense?
I think it's important for us to remember that history is curated, right? We always receive whatever it is we're taught and whatever it is we learn through curation. And so whether if it's Sunday school, then our Bible history is framed by the little Sunday school curriculum books, which may have pictures of white people identifying them as people who live in North Africa and West Asia, right? So we always get our history curated and shaped by someone. The textbooks your professor used as opposed to the ones she didn't assign, right? Sometimes when I'm in conversations with my clergy colleagues and I'll share something I'm teaching, and they'll say, well, I never learned that in seminary. I'm curating my class in a different way than their professor did. Both of them can make legitimate historical claims. So we need to realize that we are always receiving history that is shaped and packaged for us by other people. And so what is happening, and what has happened from the 60s forward in particular, but certainly in spikes in other ways before that, is people who were not in the room, not at the table, and expected to receive a history that was curated by cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied, white Protestant men. I don't know if I said heterosexual, but let's throw it in twice. And some of us said, this doesn't look like me, this doesn't feel like me, this doesn't speak to me. What else is there? And then we go to original sources, go to the full biblical text, apart from what's in the lectionary. We say, well, this Hagar character speaks to me. This other character speaks to me, and she's not even in the lectionary. So it's about curating for ourselves. And what that means, to use the example of a syllabus, as I'm preparing to teach again, is that you can't teach everything. So if you add a book by a womanist scholar, you may well have to drop another book. And if white male perspectives are overrepresented in your scholarship, then those are the books, some of the books that you're going to drop. And so that's not an erasure of history. That's not even a silencing of history. That is expanding access to the other voices that are shaping and creating history. And that's particularly important when one set of cultural voices is so loud and is the only one that has been heard and has set itself up as though it is neutral, disinterested, and factual with no equivocation.
Great, I love it. And one of the challenges some of us have heard over the years is that we are, stop me if you've heard this one before, abandoning the faith of the fathers, when from my perspective and from your description, what we're actually doing is expanding it to include the faith of the mothers as well. And I loved particularly that question that I'm going to noodle with for quite a while, not only who is the God in the text, but who is the God beyond the text. And that, I think, is a place for all of us to dwell and take both some challenge and opportunity to consider. So one just specific question, someone wants to return to when we talked about concubine, interested in a more proper understanding is the question, but can you unpack that a little bit for those of us who've not had the privilege of being your student and hearing you explain that?
So concubinage is something like long-term prostitution. A woman is often bought or sold, traded, rented, paid for, usually that fee going to a man for sexual use of her, and maybe for a lifetime. In the world of the Hebrew Bible, marriage existed at two levels. A primary wife called an isha, really the word for woman because there's not a word for wife in Hebrew, and then a secondary status or low status woman called a pelagish. Both cases, those were marriages. The men were referred to as husbands, and the children were legitimate. With a concubine, the children would not be legitimate. So some Bibles are no longer using the word concubine, and so using low status wife or secondary wife in addition to primary wife. So that's the language that is at stake there. I also saw these questions popping up, and I'll just do a couple popcorn ones. Mary Magdalene is not identified as the woman who anoints Jesus, but that's an example of the way that layers have been added to her story, and she has been folded into that in post-biblical interpretation. Add to that the inability to separate all of the Marys and figure out who did which what. And I want to take up the question that someone asked: if the Bible is not paying proper attention to women, does that mean the Bible is imperfect? It is, of course, imperfect because it is a human production. It is a human and divine production, but it is still very much a human production. It's written by men, edited by men. A few pieces we think were written by women, and there are places where we can argue for women to have had a role in editing and canon shaping. But the Bible is human and divine, and in its humanity, it is troubling. In its divinity, it is occasionally equally troubling. I use a paradigm with my students that just as Jesus is human and divine, Jesus, who is the Word, so also is the Bible, so also are the scriptures. But a lot of people come to the biblical text with the understanding that it is all divine. And that framework makes it more divine than Jesus, who is himself human and divine. So yes, the biblical text is imperfect. It is not God. It is not an object of veneration or idolization. But it is a way for us to hear from God, to experience God. Something we say in the Episcopal Church is we take the Bible too seriously to take it literally. And that's because we understand that each section of it is written in a different way. Some of it was written to be taken literally. Some of it is puns and jokes and riddles and warnings and metaphors. There's so many different genres. And some of those genres rely on very harmful stereotypes, right? So the image of God being married to Israel has built into it domestic abuse, right? When Israel doesn't do what God wants, God punishes her with violence. That is an extremely imperfect view of marriage, right? So yes, the biblical text reflects the imperfections of the human beings who authored it. Scripture is revealed through human persons, and human persons are imperfect.
Well, I see Bathsheba popping up.
Okay.
Questions about where she fits in the narrative, and also a question about where you would place Hagar. Question of, was she a prophetic voice, or where would she fit in your slideshow?
Okay, so when I did my first exercise with you about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those were the three early patriarchs. Bathsheba is in a different part of the biblical text. She is, 1,000 years later, so she is not part of the story. She's not one of the women that was married to or impregnated by those three patriarchs. So that was a very specific list. Bathsheba is an incredibly important figure, and I spend some good deal of time on her in the book Womanist Midrash. She is the first queen mother of Israel, and that office of queen mother will continue through the Judean side when the two nations break apart. And one of the things that delighted me as I was working on the book Womanist Midrash is that we do have the names of the Judean queen mothers, and I argue that's because of Bathsheba and the tradition that built up around her. One of the things we do know from the text is that Solomon had a throne brought for her and set at his right side, making her the second most powerful person in the monarchy. And then he got off his throne and bowed to her, which would mean that everybody in the room would have gotten down and bowed because the king was bowing. So she actually leaves the biblical text in a very exalted position, shaping, I believe, the monarchy for years to follow, particularly in the Judean kingdom. Great question.
Here's a great one from Dan McCarroll. Do you see repetition of women's names, quote, all the Marys, as a method of anonymizing the contributions of women? Could it have been convenient for the male authors to reuse a woman's name as a way to encourage confusion about their role and importance?
I don't think we can ever rule anything out. I think that's possible. But I will also say, in terms of the prominence of the name Miriam, based on the prophet Miriam, that the prophet Miriam is very prominent in the Hebrew Bible. She's in multiple books of the Torah, and she shows up in the book of Micah. Many people know, what does the Lord require of you but to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with your God? In the larger unit there, God sues Israel, or maybe Israel sues God, but there's a courtroom scene, and God asks, what have I ever done to you? And God says, here's what I've done. I gave you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. And so in Micah's memory, what God has done for Israel is to give them these three leading figures. And it's fascinating to see that so long after the Exodus narrative, here's a prophet saying, let's not forget the prophet Miriam. She's one of God's good gifts to Israel. Then as you go forward into the book of Chronicles, you see that people are naming their daughters after Miriam. When you look in the rabbinic literature, there's lots of people named Miriam. So I think realistically, her name became prominent and people were naming their daughters Miriam in great numbers. But I don't rule out the possibility of authors and editors not trying to sort people out and leaving them lumped together and confused, because they could have identified them and separated them.
Right.
Thank you.
So here's another great question. They're all good questions. You guys are awesome out there. And I think this one leads to that idea of the God in the text and outside the text. So Julianne is asking, can you talk more about how we reconcile a God who used and blessed men and who inflicted violence against women and others? What is the accountability, and how do we take that into our practice now?
I think we have to ask the question, is this God? We can say that the authors understood it as God, and they understood it through their Iron Age world, culture, ethics, and values. And sometimes we see things in that Iron Age ethical setting that transcended, which is part of the power and beauty of the scriptures. But I am reluctant to say, just because the text says that that is God. And I often push this question back to my students. If this is God, then what do you do with it, him, her, right? What do we do? In practice, as a priest, as a pastor, as a preacher, I read the biblical text through the lenses of love, justice, and mercy. That's a choice. And everyone who reads makes a choice, right? People love to say that they read the Bible literally, that they fulfill it literally, but no one in even the most fundamentalist church is having exorcisms for people who are hearing impaired. And that's what Jesus did. Jesus used the language of demons with hearing impaired people. That reflects the limited medical knowledge of the first century. The same with people having seizures and epilepsy, saying that they're demoniacs and need to be exorcised, right? We don't read those passages literally because we know more about the human body and the human mind and human wellness. We don't throw the Gospels out, we don't throw Jesus out, but we don't try to imitate those texts literally. We're using a filter. But the problem with the way we talk about the Bible publicly and in our churches is we don't always identify that we are in fact using a filter, that we are curating the biblical text, that we are reading through a lens, and everyone does, right? Some people read through the lens that says the hierarchical arrangement of women and men is God ordained and should never change. Of course, they read the same way about slavery, and they read the same way about people's intimate lives and loves, right? But we don't all read that way. So we need to be honest about the lenses we bring to the text and what that means. And I also advocate for wrestling with those difficult texts, not just not reading them, not talking about them, but saying this too is a part of our scriptural heritage and we have to come to terms with it.
Perfect. So glad. Just a quick commercial in case you came in late or you know someone who wished they'd signed up for this and were listening. This will be archived on our YouTube channel and you'll be able to share it and watch it later. So here's a great question to contemporize it just a little bit. Are there contemporary prophets who you might identify as continuing the prophetic traditions of ancient women such as Miriam?
So prophecy is a gift that the church believes continued into the Christian Testament. Living churches now have different conversations about it, but I certainly believe the prophetic is still active in a variety of ways. I will say this that is only partially a joke. Anybody who puts prophet on their business card is probably not a prophet. But there are people who do prophetic work. And so I would say, as an example, my beloved friend, Tracy Blackman, is one such person. In addition to Reverend Blackman, I would say the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey is a prophet, does prophetic work. I tend to describe it in terms of doing the work rather than the title, because I think church folk can become too consumed with titles. But absolutely, there are women and men and non-binary people who do prophetic work in this world. Absolutely. Okay, we are coming close to the end of time, but we have time for a couple more. Clara is wondering about Lot's story and his wife being turned into a pillar of salt. What do we make of that? So we have to ask, what is the genre of the text? What is it doing? So here's an example I use in class. I don't know that anybody reads newspapers anymore. I've clung to the idea of a newspaper for this, but okay, I'm gonna update it to a tablet. So you're reading your local or national paper of choice on your tablet, and you see the words, aliens invade. Well, what do? Well, if it's on the top of the web page under the header, Well, you might need to move into your basement with some canned goods until it all gets sorted out. But if you see the words in your paper of choice, aliens invade, on the entertainment page, you might take your family to a virtually distant drive-in movie, right? The words are true in both cases, but the genre of the literature, entertainment pages versus breaking news, tell you two entirely different things about it, right? So what we do with this, with the story of Lot, and not just his wife turning to salt, but the story that each of his daughters got him drunk, had sex with him and conceived, and either did that miraculously one time, one night, or did that for as long as possible to become pregnant because they didn't think there were any more people in the world. And that the children they gave birth to were named Ben-Ami, meaning son of my father, and Moab, meaning from my father. And that's how the nations of Ammon and Moab got their names. So that's what the Lot story is. Now, do you think the people of Moab and Ammon tell the same story about where their nations come from and what their name means? Of course not. This is an Israelite ideology explaining the names and hostilities with two neighboring peoples on their borders that they had perpetual skirmishes with, and remembering that these stories are collected and edited thousands of years later, or centuries later, in some cases, 1,000 years later. They are more reflective of what's happening closer to the Babylonian invasion than what was happening in the period in which Genesis or even the Exodus is set. So we read that story knowing when it received its final edit, when it was assembled into the canon, and what purpose it's serving. It's to give the nations of Moab and Ammon a bad name, to identify them as bad seed. That's the purpose of the story.
Wow. My brain is swimming with other stories we're hearing about other people in the news and swirling around us. A lot there to chew and think about. Time for maybe another question or two. And since it is Mary Magdalene's Day, there was one question from Clara about the significance of Mary Magdalene washing the feet of Jesus.
Well, we don't know that that was Mary Magdalene. That identification is complicated. But the foot washing was an act of service, an act of humility, an act of hospitality, and it gets signified in the Gospels as, particularly with anointing, that it's preparing Jesus for his burial, because the way that he will die and the way his body will be left will mean that he won't have the full preparation on the front side. And of course, the writers know, and we know, that they won't in fact be able to come back and finish up later because the story is going to have a dramatic change. So that anointing has always been read in the scriptures in its earliest interpretations as attending to the physical body of Jesus, the incarnation, in a way that addressed and prepared for mortality.
And then here's one from Dorothy, who wonders why, in her experience, the Episcopal Church seems to give little attention to Mary as the Mother of God, and why we don't do the Hail Mary in the Episcopal Church.
So that's a question for other minds than me. I can say that the diversity of our church, which is a good thing, theologically diverse, means that there are places that are very, very Catholic, and the liturgy reflects that. So there are places where it happens. In my experience, I'm still a member of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas, which some of you may know is the first Episcopal church by and for Black folk on this continent, founded in 1792. And there, I and an elder priest, Pastor Sadie, both had the habit during funerals of right before the procession of saying the Hail Mary with our hand on the coffin. And I didn't realize that we both had that same tradition. I know I say the Ave, sometimes I say it in Latin. I went to Catholic high school. I know many people who do in their piety, but in terms of publicly, I don't know. I think that has something to do with the sort of liturgical channels we find ourselves in, even with the diversity we have.
Great. Well, we have exactly 5 minutes left. So if you would humor us, I would just love to hear just a little bit more of an update on where you are on the Women's Lectionary Project and what we might do to entice you back at such time as we're able to do that safely for another stint as a scholar in resident. I know we're seeing lots of stuff in the chat about wanting to do book groups, and folks are jumping on that opportunities to both buy your books and have conversations about them. So I know that your work in witness is going to continue to inform our discussion and dialogue here at All Saints. But if you could just give us a quick update on the lectionary project before we let you go and go to Children's Chapel.
Sure. So I'm writing a women's lectionary in which I'm selecting all new texts for each Sunday in the liturgical calendar, along with things like Easter week and Holy Week, and selected saints. And of course, Mary Magdalene is in my lectionary. And so the first year, year A, has been completed. It's at the publishing house. I imagine it will be marked up and sent back to me. And the second year is actually year W. I'm doing 4 years. And year W is for congregations that just want to preach a year through women, but they're not on the lectionary system and they can't make a 3-year commitment. So year W, I am up to the season after Pentecost. And of course, I've had to set it aside to prepare for my fall courses, but I'll pick it up once I get the syllabi out and the website's done. So that will be the first volume, and the hope is that it would be published in 2021. We actually have a soft agreement about cover art. There's an artist who I love. I purchased one of her pieces and she's given permission. And so the press is doing whatever it is they do. The second volume, years B and C, are gonna have to wait because in between the 2 volumes, I'm doing a second volume of Womanist Midrash focused on prophetic texts. So that's already pre-started. I'll finish that, then I'll switch to B and C. And so I would imagine the second volume would be out maybe in 2023. But I have good news for you at All Saints. Mike is on vacation, so he got the email, but he's not processed it, and that's fine. We want him to stay within his boundaries. But the press has given permission for All Saints to use year A, next liturgical year A, with some caveats about, you know, protecting some of it, but you all will be using year A.
Woohoo. Woohoo. I'm not muted. Yay. I can hear the applause and the cheers. We are at 10:59. We're about to stick the landing of the forum on Mary Magdalene. We want to, again, please express our tremendous thanks and gratitude to Dr. Gafney for joining us today. For all of you, I mean, nothing like some great, stimulating biblical exegesis, scholarship, and challenge in the middle of otherwise really challenging summer. So thank you so much for being with us today and for your continued work and witness. We're so grateful to be part of your orbit. If you don't follow Dr. Gafney on Twitter, you should. She's a great follow at Wil, W-I-L-Gafney. And It is now 10:59.5, so I'm going to ask Keith to send us over to Kelly Aaron so they can launch us into Children's Chapel. Thank you again, Dr. Gafney.